Again, thanks everybody for joining us. We have a fun talk of a different type today. Charles Aybar has joined us. Charles had a great job after the fair. The New York State Pavilion became a roller rink, and Charles will talk about how part of that came about and his rather unique job that he had there, and then some of the things that have happened to the pavilion over the years since then. So, Charles, good morning.
Good morning to you, Bill, and good morning to all the fans of the New York World's Fair and the New York State Pavilion. Nice to be here and nice to see everyone.
Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put everybody on mute as usual. If you have things, you can throw them in the chat. And if Charles or I see it, as we're talking back and forth, and we'll do a Q&A after. So let me just mute everybody here. And now, Charles, you'll have to unmute yourself so we can continue to talk.
Done.
So I just thought for the folks that are not all that familiar with it, I would bring up some pictures and go through some thoughts on the New York State Pavilion, and then we can talk about the things in particular Charles did. So let me just share the screen here real quick. So helicopter view of the New York State Pavilion, like this one because, so keep in mind how big and how tall. Oh, it says Zoom quit unexpectedly. Well, that's different.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yeah, Zoom quit. Hang on.
Yeah, I ran into something.
Yeah, Don, I'm trying to get back into Zoom. Okay, there we go. Now I gotta stop that. Ah, wow,
Okay.
different.
You got a lot of reverb, Bill. Big echo chamber.
Yeah, I'm trying to turn off the other speaker on the laptop, and it won't turn off.
Pitch hitting for the Yankees.
Hopefully that does it now. Nope, the speaker keeps coming back on. Let me turn off the laptop.
Could it be he has two versions of Zoom going on at the same time? Well, we'll just sit here and be patient, I guess, right?
You're muted, Bill. You're muted.
I don't know what's going on. I had the laptop running over here, which I usually do, so I could just watch for chats and that. And all of a sudden on my main screen, it came up, Zoom has quit unexpectedly. Would you like to send a report to Zoom? And no, I don't. I want to get back into the talk. So let me try this again. So I was going back to the New York State Pavilion. Hopefully everybody sees it. Isn't technology wonderful? So anyway,
there we go.
New York State Pavilion, I want to just basically remind people how large this thing was. So as Charles gets into his exploits up on the roof, people can think about how lucky he is to be here live with us today. So a nice view of the concave dish that was the roof of tomorrow. Also want to emphasize the shape of it, that it was not a flat pancake. When he talks about what it was like and how it contributed to its own self-destruction. And Charles, jump in any time you have anything you want to add on any of these.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, you can see from the bird's eye view what the structure actually looked like, and it is a concave design, which evidently helps with drainage of water, and that actually was detrimental to the roof. That design, they never put it into a wind tunnel, realizing that Flushing Meadow Corona Park receives winds in excess of 70, 80 miles an hour at times, and that caused a lot of issues later on with the panels coming off, which I'll discuss momentarily.
Yeah, it's all the things out there. When you looked at the things like the Tower of the Four Winds, they had to build it to withstand hurricanes, and all the various pavilions, because they get some pretty wicked winds. If a hurricane had actually come through there, I think it would have been a real mess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, we're still above all the white dots are lights, correct?
That's correct. And each one of those fixtures, there were metal fixtures that held a 100-watt clear bulb. And I had the opportunity to replace a lot of those. And as a teenager, there were times where I would go up with a couple of buddies, and we'd kind of mess around and have a light bulb fight. And as ironic as that sounds, I mean, it wasn't like a snowball fight. It was glass, and you just had to watch not to hit someone in the face. But we had our fun in the glass. Of course, the bolts would shatter all over the top of the roof, and no one cared to clean it up. It was just there. We were hoping that the wind would blow it down towards the center part, which you see right there of the roof. That's the tension ring, as we called it.
Yeah, it had this big plastic thing in the center, long gone. But that's so all the rain didn't come down and fall into the middle of the tent. The rain that would come down would go off into a pipe that ran around the ring, then it went off into a drain pipe that you can still see out there today.
Yeah, that's correct. There were 4 pipes that would go ahead and collect that rain. And to give you an idea how thick that plexiglass was, it was probably around 2 inches thick, at least 2 inches thick, and very, very well constructed.
Yeah, here it is being put together. Luckily, the people did not have to go all the way up and put the thing together up on the the higher level. So here's the metal crown put in place, and the first panels are going onto it. It's interesting that even there, at the beginning, they must have had the idea that this thing had to be strong enough for people to walk on, because they had to walk on it to build it. So, I don't know how much thought they went into how thick those things had to be, how strong they had to be, but I was impressed that people could safely walk on it like that.
Yes, and back then, of course, they didn't have the technology as we have today. So those panels were not as durable as they were being manufactured today. The resins and the UV protection was very, very limited. They were, and I'll show you and everyone else in just a little bit how they were actually constructed. But for the most part, these panels were assembled on the ground and carried up and put into place, as you see. And what held them in place was a clip, a purling clip that snapped onto the upper cable. And that actually failed as time went on, as we found out back in the early 70s because of the high winds. But that wasn't taken into consideration during the construction phase.
And again, the roof is up. We're looking down from the observation tower, but I wanted to point out the columns here. The tent is held up by these concrete columns. The roof, of course, is held up by the steel ring. But if you look at these columns, most of them have a little platform out there, which you would be able to get onto the platform at the top. And I don't know if you ever did this, Charles. You'd have to go onto the tent, climb onto the metal, and then onto the little platform. There wasn't a ladder or anything that went up from above, or from below, rather. You had to get to these platforms from up above if you were going to change these flags, correct?
Well, all those columns that you see except one, so there's 16 columns. The remaining 15 would require a cherry picker to hoist a person all the way up on top to change those flags out.
Okay.
There was no other way that one could climb off of the roof onto those little platforms that you see.
And again, this kind of just gives you an idea of the height looking down. You could also see the roofs on the observation platforms were the same construction technique as the tent of tomorrow, correct?
Correct, but it was not concave, it was convex.
Right. So if you look here, we said for the title of this talk, "The Last Man on the Roof." Well, I was joking with Charles earlier. He wasn't the only guy in the roof. This is back in April '64, and he's probably up there fixing some of the last minute things. But you can see a fellow walking up there. If you look over at the rightmost column, you can see a little metal ladder that goes from the column up to the roof. So would you like to talk about the stairs that went up there?
Yes, so in order to gain access to that ladder, you had to go to the column that was the closest to the Theaterama building. And there was, to prevent people from going in and out, kind of like a screen door that pulled up and allowed you access in between the column. And then from there, you can go up the stairs up to that ladder. Now, where that ladder is, that aluminum ladder, there was also another ladder that laid flat on the roof. And the purpose for that was to gain stability when you actually did walk on the roof. And I don't know if that was there during the fair. I don't see any pictures that would show that wooden ladder. It was just an extension ladder. It might have been put there post-fair, but we did utilize that not to step on the outer panels because they were the ones that were really, really loose.
Yeah, you can just see, I don't think I've seen any pictures that show the ladder up there during the fair. So it was probably some Parks Department addition for safety measures after. You can just see the edge of the ladders that we're mentioning going up the tower. And if you look real close, you can see a staircase going up the middle of the tower. We were
That's
talking yesterday that none of that was treated metal and everything was starting to rust even by the time you were there.
Yes, you can start to see the deterioration of the compression ring, which is the outer ring, as well as the tension ring. Back in 1969, when I was there in the park, there was already a lot of rust starting to form. And when I got up there back in 71, it was just myself and the rink operator, Bob Jellin. And how this all started, I think I need to let everyone know. So I was a fan, of course, of the World's Fair. I was there in 64 and 65. I enjoyed the New York State Pavilion. Something attracted me to that building more than anything else. And in 67 through 1971, I attended the park quite frequently. And back then, no one was in the park, very few people. You can go and walk the park 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock midnight and find absolutely no one in the park. It was rarely, rarely used, except for the concerts that were taking place throughout, I believe it was 69 and 70. There were hardly anyone going to Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. So one day back in 71, I was a figure skater taking training lessons over at the New York City Pavilion. And I was expecting my girlfriend from Bayside to come in and skate with me afterwards, because that was the plan all the time when I went over to skate. Long story short, she didn't show up. So I decided to walk over to the New York State Pavilion and just kind of wander around. And there I met Chris and Bob Jellin. And I asked Chris what was going on. She says, "Oh, we're going to make this into a roller rink." And she said to me, "I see you got skates." I said, "Yeah, I skate." I'm like, "Roller rink?" I said, "That sounds like a lot of fun." And she says, "Yeah, I'm an artistic roller skater." I'm like, "What?" I didn't even understand what that term meant, which would have been the same as a figure skater on rollers opposed to ice. So I got into a great conversation with her and Bob. And I asked them, I said, "Hey, do you guys need any help?" And she said, "Yeah, we can use your help." And Bob said, "Come on over. I got a job for you." And here are all these blue globes. And we're all familiar with these here, of course. There were hundreds of these lying along the side of the building that Bob had taken down. And my task was to go ahead and clean them out because we were going to rehang these up. Now, most of the ones that we hung up were at all the entrances. The others that you see up on the poles on the upper mezzanine were taken down probably around 1970 because a lot of those were failing due to the high winds, due to the extreme coldness, and they're not made very well. They're made very cheaply, by the way. Most of them were stored inside the pavilion as well as in the Theaterama building, because I had a chance later on to see, again, hundreds of these stored in the Theaterama building. And I was wondering why they were there. And these were the ones that were taken off the mezzanine and stored. But there were quite a few broken because of the weather, as I mentioned, and a lot of vandals. So a lot of people that attended these concerts at the end of the concert just wanted to go ahead and destroy things that were in sight. And a lot of the graffiti that was found in the park was caused, in my opinion, by these people that were coming in. Any typical weekend night, like on a Friday night, and I'm sure those that were in the park back then can concur, you would find a group of hippies, because that was the word and that was the style, a group of hippies hanging out by the Unisphere, smoking pot and asking people if they'd like to come on by and join them. And that was the theme back then in the late 1960s, early 70s. So I guess to speed things up forward, after I started cleaning all these globes, there were other things in the pavilion to do, such as getting up on the roof. And the first time that I was up there, Bob just told me, he said, no, don't look down. And now Bob had worked at the World Trade Center. So he was used to working as an electrician, installing Otis elevators for the contract that he had specialized in. And walking between the shafts of the elevator was nothing to him. He would just be walking on a 2x4 right across and think nothing of it. So here I was up there. I watched him. He said, "Now just don't look down." He said, "Just walk on the sides of the fiberglass panels where it would hold more of your weight." And I got used to it. Of course, I would hold on to those cables, and those are 2.5 to 2 3/4 inch thick cables that you see holding the roof up, and those cables also holding those lights were about the same. So I would hold on to those cables just in case. But there was one situation that I stepped on a panel and it disappeared underneath my feet, just gone. And I looked down to watch it. It was just unbelievable. And it scared me.
There's a shot of you I put up there changing the lights, and you can see the columns in it, but you're happily just kneeling 100-something feet in the air on a 2-inch piece of plastic.
Yeah. Now I was standing in the inner tension ring, and you could easily fit in between there, but those lights there were in kind of like a canister, and you had these wing nuts to loosen up and pull them out, and then there were 500-watt lights that had a ceramic plug. You had to remove the plug and replug them in and adjust the light so it would aim properly on the floor. It was a lot of fun.
Well, it's all different. So he told you just don't look down, and that one day you did look down at the hole in the roof, and you must have had some. Did you ever tell your parents any of this stuff?
Well, to be honest with you, one time I was messing around and broke my ankle, okay, on my skates. And my parents got called up from Booth Memorial Hospital there on Casino Boulevard. Those that you live in Flushing remember Booth Memorial. So my mom and dad get a call that they had to go to the hospital. And my mom remembered me working up on the roof, and she didn't know what to think. They just said, "You have to come to the hospital. There's an emergency. Your son got injured." So they came in, and just for fun as a teenager, I had a sheet wrapped up protecting my legs. I pulled it over my head. So I was just covered completely with the sheet, and I just laid still. And my mother saw me there, and they said, "Your son's in that room." She saw me there, and she just freaked out. And I pulled it quickly, and I said, I'm okay. I just broke my ankle." And she never forgave me for that. She almost had a heart attack there. My dad was pure white. And of course, I never heard the end of not going back up on the roof, but that had nothing to do with me breaking my ankle. It came from skating and not being on the roof. So I did go up many, many times and realize Bob and I were the very first ones up there. The Parks Department had an office at the pavilion where workers would come in and change their uniforms and get dressed for their duty and keep various equipment stored in one of the storerooms there. And I got to know these guys on a one-on-one basis, including the park engineer. His name was Nick Fichera. Became a really, really good friend and an advocate of the park as well as the State Pavilion. So everyone would just think we were both nuts, Bob and I, going up on the roof. Nick told me that no one from the Parks Department went up there, absolutely no one, and it was forbidden. He wouldn't go up there. But he did mention as time progressed that he would go out with the survey guys and they would measure the columns to see how far they would be either sustaining their weights or if they were starting to sink. And I remember very clearly, he told me the 2 columns over by the entrance, which would be by the Vatican Pavilion, those were sinking about 6 inches per year. And this was back in 71. Of course, they didn't do the surveying like we would have now. They were just a couple guys out there taking measurements, and he told me, he said it was sinking 6 inches, and that's where you find a lot of the foundational cracks in the CMU, or the cinder block walls in that area. They were cracked back then, so the building was shifting because of the deterioration of the pilings, the untreated pilings. Now realize, I got to go back into the construction of the building. So when they decided to make the pavilion, they utilized untreated piles, and 26 of these piles, about 12 inches thick, approximately, I believe it was about 80 feet in length, were drilled down into the ground. And they knew the water table of the pavilion was kind of questionable, but someone said, okay, we'll just go ahead and raise the water level to where the piles would not be treated. Well, the piles being untreated would not be affected because the water would prevent them from rotting. And that plan was never carried out. So someone else came along while they were putting these piles in and said, well, the bearing weight of the roof and the columns is not going to support most of these piles. So we're going to go ahead and put in H steel piles throughout the columns. And we don't know how many were put in. There was estimates between 1 to 4, and we don't know exactly where they would be. But when these piles were driven in, and some of these H piles or H steel piles were put in to support the weight, a 4-foot cap of concrete was poured to support those columns. Now, as time progressed, back in 92, C.R. Dulo was one of the engineers that did an engineering survey, and they had found deterioration up to a couple of inches where the piles were exposed. And then subsequently, a couple years later, they found rot up to 6 inches, from 2 to 6 inches, and they had claimed that there could have been a catastrophic failure of these columns. And the Parks Department just shook their head and didn't do anything about it. Here's one of their own reports. Subsequently, later on, there have been other reports that indicate that, things were a little bit more stable. My feeling is that those pilings, which are exposed to not only rot, but they're insects that will be eating them throughout the years, trying to just destroy it, and fungus and everything else. Eventually, something is going to give. And all it's going to take is one column to get unstable, and it'll just pull everything down. And this is something both Frankie Campione of Create and myself pleaded with the city. Frankie had hired one of the top surveyors in the country, the guy that was working on the Lincoln Memorial, to take a look at the reports that were given to the Parks Department by their contractors. And he assessed that, yeah, a lot of work had to be done. And it's a wonder that those columns are still standing. So, it's a miracle that the building still is standing straight up. Nothing has been addressed throughout the years. I know that Philip Johnson commented, when we build something forever. And certainly he knew about the situation where the water table should have been raised. And even after the fair, words from the Parks Department and other professionals, when they handed the building from the state ownership to the city, there was a lot of questions about raising the water table, and nothing was done. So if they raised the water table, yeah, the building would surely be stable, a lot more stable than what it is, considering that they did put in H-pile steel beams in there to support the building. Again, it's a miracle that it's standing. There's a reason for it. And I think that it will have to definitely be addressed in the future.
Right. Yeah, we'll take a look at, for the folks that are not familiar, we'll take a look in a few minutes at the proposals you did to turn the pavilion into a airspace museum. But I'd like to jump back, if we could, into when you first got there, because everybody sees it today as a ruin. Some people have been lucky enough to take tours of it. And, people like Jim Brown are here. You know that the whole mezzanine is just full of garbage and all sorts of stuff. When you said you got there, it was pretty much a clean slate. All traces of the fair had pretty much been wiped out, and you had all these empty rooms, correct?
Correct. The place was pristine, absolutely spotless. And all those rooms that Jim Brown, and thank you, Jim Brown, for your years of service and keeping the pavilion cosmetically up. I mean, it's wonderful. And I have to say accolades to Jim Brown and to Johnny Pyro and all the other people, Mitch Silverstein, that gave their labor of love, and gave of their own funds to get this thing at least looking wonderful. But all of those rooms there were pristine. You could see that after the fair, they did put in drop ceilings and they put in lighting where those blue globes were placed in the restaurant areas, over by a lot of the other rooms that still had the remaining blue globes. Everything was pristine. There was nothing wrong with the building at all. There were dressing rooms. I remember going in, and showers. Everything worked. The air conditioning, the heating, everything was ready to go.
Yeah, it's certainly changed over time now. You had pictures, I can try to look at them in a second, of the skating. What did they do to the terrazzo floor to make that a flat, even surface for skaters?
So after we went up, Bob and I, and eventually we hired two other guys to help us bolt down some of the panels that were questionable. And it was kind of a unique technique that Bob had put together, and that was to drill a hole through the panel and throw a rope in that hole all the way down. It had to be at least a 100-foot rope, all the way down to the ground, where someone would tie on a bolt, and we pull that bolt through the panel and then put a lock nut on it, so the sandwich between the panels would hold in place. But that wasn't really the issue. But that helped at least stabilize parts of the exterior of the roof. The interior was not too bad. But getting back to your question, the floor itself, there was all kinds of groups against having the roller rink there. And that was mainly because they were all afraid that roller skating was going to destroy the mat. That was the big issue with a lot of the community groups. They were afraid that the mat was going to be destroyed by all these skaters rolling on it. So Bob, in his wisdom, came up with a solution to appease most of the people, and that was we were going to go ahead and coat the floor with a urethane plastic. And this coating, we probably put on about 3-4 coats every couple of months to protect the mat. And realized the mat was pretty much pristine, but there were sections that were purposely taken out and never replaced, and they were filled with concrete. I don't know why. And they were not smooth. Bob had to come in with a special grinder to grind down those areas. There probably were about 3 or 4 areas that the tiles were removed. But for the most part, that floor was in great condition. It wasn't cracking. There was issues with drainage, and we had to pull out some of the sections where the drains were plugged up, realizing that, for about 7 years, no one cared about the plumbing of the building, let alone the floor. So we had to address all of that, and we would keep the floor clean by using a Clark manufacturing. Clark was the manufacturer of this floor scrubber that would scrub the floor, put down water, and pick it up at the same time, keep the surface really clean. But that floor was absolutely great to skate on. We had issues with pigeon droppings because the pigeons just used to love hanging out above us over on those cables, and they would poop all over the place, poop on skaters. And when you're rolling on the floor, it could be an issue. So we would just kind of at times turn up the music, and that would scare the birds. But after a while, they would become acclimated, and different services we looked at to take care of the issue came in and said, oh, we'll put up, some sort of poison or some sort of air cannon. But we decided not to go that route because we just didn't have, at least Bob didn't have the funds to go ahead and move it forward.
And when we were talking last night, you mentioned about, exploring the rooms we were just talking about, but maybe you'd like to tell people about your exploring the Theaterama building as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I became really good friends with a lot of the Parks Department people because they had their offices there and they admired me being a teenager going up on that roof, taking such a risk. So there were times where I had asked, I said, can I go up into the towers? Can I go into the Theaterama? And they literally just handed me the keys and said, hey, here's the keys. Don't worry about it. I want you to hang up these keys when you finish over here. So I would explore the Theaterama quite frequently. And back then, just before the executive director of one of the CBS TV shows decided to make it into a playhouse, I had an opportunity to get into the building. And one time I took Bob and Chris with me, the rink operators, and we kind of looked around. We saw where in the sub-basement structure of the Theaterama, there was a meltdown of one of the transformers. And it probably happened during the fair. And this part of the sub-basement was darkened by this meltdown of this transformer. It was never replaced. Evidently, the other several transformers that were there were enough to take over the loss of control and of power. But I found a box, a pretty nice sized box of 8x10 black and white photos. And these were the very early construction photos of putting the building up, as well as during the fair. There were hundreds of pictures. It showed very, very close up photos of the companies drilling down into the ground for the pilings and the roof being raised up and the support system that was there. It was very, very intriguing. And I gave that to Bob and Chris. We looked at them and I asked Chris throughout the years, I said, do you remember that box? And she's still looking for it. So maybe it'll show up someday, but it'll solve a lot of mysteries, of course, including the steel pilings that were put in periodically in the foundations, or strategically is a better word. But the Theaterama still had its camera system, its projection system intact.
Well, that's
And
interesting. I didn't realize that had been left after the fair.
yeah, it was still there. And of course, you walked up the spiral staircase from down below, from the offices to the main lobby of the building where the show was given during the fair, 360-degree theater experience. And from that point, you could gain access to where these cameras were, which were kind of up, way up by the roof area. And that's where I discovered hundreds of these blue globes stored in one of the storerooms. There's storerooms in there between the walls, the outer walls and the inner walls. And they're probably, I don't know, maybe 6 feet in width. And there's a stairway system throughout that brings you up to the very top, not to the roof, but to where the camera system or projection system was. And they were all there. Eventually, they were taken out. The owner of those had a lien against, I guess, the state, and then it was released. And back in, I think it's 72 or 73, he took them out.
That's amazing. And
Yeah.
again, we were talking last night. I asked, Charles, hey, how often did you go up to the observation towers, which is like a holy grail to probably most of the people on this call? And he just nonchalantly says, "Oh, every day."
Yeah,
So,
I went up there every day as much as I could. And the police would do their patrols at night and see the tent of tomorrow all lit up. Bob and I would be working and they would come in and ask questions. So we got to know them really well. And they'd come in with pizza and sandwiches and invite us for dinner. So one time, one of the police officers had asked me, hey, did you ever go up in the towers? I'm like, yeah, I'm up there every day kind of looking around. And he says, hey, do you think I can go up, or maybe a couple of the guys can go up? I said, sure. I said, let me first light the thing up. So I'd have to go into the Theaterama building, down to their sub basement, turn on all the light switches, turn on the transformer, and the whole thing just lit up like a big candle. And I had the keys that accessed the staircase. So The easiest way up would be access to the first staircase in the smaller tower, which was, of course, back then a place where you can meet senators and Congress people and had a lounge in there. Well, after the fair, everything was taken out except its glass walls. There was no plumbing, no nothing there. I was shocked to find from other people that went up there later on that they actually had sinks and they had bathroom facilities in the lower tower, because there was no way that back in 71 that you could see any trace of that. So we would go, from the smaller tower. From there, you can go on to the second tower. There was an access stairs leading up, and eventually all the way up on the top. And it was a lot of fun. It was great looking around. And of course, everything was illuminated. Most of the lights worked. It was a great experience. Most of the time it was very windy up there. And there was no souvenirs left behind, as a lot of people would think. Even in the main pavilion, I've always gotten emails or requests to find out, hey, what was left in all those storerooms? Was there anything from the fair? Absolutely nothing. Nothing at all.
Yeah, they pretty much cleaned it all out as per the contract and turned it over. Well, a lot of people may or may not know that building was originally, like everything else, supposed to be torn down after the fair. The governor wanted to keep it up. Moses wanted to tear it all down. So, the fact that it stayed up was kind of politics at its highest. New York didn't have to pay to take it down. New York City got this great, I guess, great with apostrophe gift that they didn't know what to do with. But you were talking about when you met Mr. Moses, folks might like to hear a bit about that.
So Robert Moses would transverse the park quite frequently. After all, it was his park. He was very proud of it. It took him 2 World's Fairs to accomplish what he did back in '67. And occasionally you would see a black limousine riding around at any given week. And one time he came to the pavilion and got out of his car. I didn't know who he was. I thought it was some rich guy that just was looking to talk or maybe invest into some sort of sporting venue. I had no idea. And he had asked me, he said, what's going on here? And I told him we're going to make this into a roller rink. And he kind of shook his head and he goes, this is supposed to be a performing arts center. I said, well, roller skating is a performing arts, it's a sport. And he just looked at me and shook his head and kind of gazed around, got back in the car and drove off. And that story, by the way, was concurred by the late David Oates. David and I knew of each other back in the early '70s, but we became good friends before his death. And I really miss David. He had a lot of great stories about Robert Moses and the park and his efforts to save the structures.
Yeah, it must have been bittersweet for him to see the park being built, but not to the grand scheme that he had originally intended. Now,
You have to realize back then the city was going broke. The city inherited all these buildings that they had no funding for. So how in the world were they going to maintain these buildings? They couldn't even maintain their own city building. It was falling apart back then in '67. You could see signs of deterioration. And throughout the years, just got worse. So there was no money for anything. And being that the political leaders shied away from Flushing Meadows Park and concentrated on Central Park, of course, because of all the inhabitants living around there, all the big money that was residing and being spent to keep up the park, that was the focus. Flushing Meadow Park was an afterthought.
Yeah, I had mentioned in prior talks, and when Charles and I were talking last night, I went back to the park somewhere around 1970 and was just appalled at the condition of it. But that makes me think of another thing. When you were working there, looking across the desolate area of the park, I'm sure your eyes lit many times upon the United States Pavilion. So I know that you and Joey had lots of fun going in there. So maybe you'd like to talk about some of your experiences over at that rec.
Yes. So can I share my screen for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. You should still be marked as a co-host.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so most of you know the park. If you were around in 67, this is what it basically looked like, correct? It was pretty desolate. You could still see the Greyhound building there, later on to be torn down. The trees were not mature. And the United States Pavilion, you could see over to the right, it was pristine, but empty to say the least. Let's see.
Yes, the Greyhound building, which had been retained with the thought of turning it into a firehouse, and they eventually decided it was too expensive, so it came down. But it was one of the last buildings to survive from the fair.
Yeah, and sorry I can't get this to work as cooperatively as I intended to. So here's a snapshot, and these pictures are from the Parks Department archives. You could see where the zoo area was not even conceived at that time, and the State Pavilion in the background. It gives you an idea of how desolate things were back in 67.
Yeah, not a lot of vegetation.
Not at all. And let's see. I'll go back to my pictures. I wanted to show you the construction of the panels. I think that's really, really important. So the fiberglass panels that were manufactured by Caldwell, this is how they would have been constructed. They had a perimeter that was made out of aluminum, and then they had these aluminum inserts called mullions that supported the interior of the structure, and then these muntins that were also added to form the structural grid core. And this is the actual composition of the fiberglass panel. It would have been a clear or opaque panel on the outside, as that would have been the top of the roof, followed by a colored panel on the interior of the panel. So that's how basically they were put together, and how they were sandwiched together. I get back to my pictures here. Let's see.
Screenshot 12.
Yeah, I'll get to that.
Okay.
I just got to rearrange my screen here. There we go. So you can see here, these are the sizes of the aluminum inserts. And the typical weight of those panels, by the way, were about 1.5 pounds per square foot. And let's see how they were clamped. And you see some other pictures there, but I'll get into that. These how they were bolted together. This is called a clamp tight system that was invented by Caldwell. This picture shows a panel to the left and a panel to the right, and a screw and a clamping system that allowed expansion and contraction. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a purlin clip would be used to hold the two panels, in this case, what you would be seeing, in place on the upper cable system. Unfortunately, the high winds posed an aerodynamic force, and aerodynamics is my background. I came from the aerospace defense industry. And when I looked at the roof and its design currently, I noticed a couple of things, and I had conversations with Bruce Keller and many years ago about redoing the roof when we had the museum concept. And he told me that the roof was constructed too rigidly, that the cables didn't allow any sway or any give, and therefore the panels start to give out. But that's his theory, and he's entitled to it. I look at it from an aerodynamic standpoint, and that is the outer portion and the design of the roof, which is pretty much a concave design, as we talked about earlier. Get back to that picture. So that allowed for water drainage, but it also, the outer portions of the roof panels kind of formed an airfoil. Now, in order to be a true airfoil, the panels would have to have a curve to it, and we call that a camber. But it didn't form a true airfoil, but somewhat of an airfoil. So the design of the roof actually caused a pressure variation system to incur. And that is, you have high pressure over the top of the roof, followed by low pressure being exerted underneath the roof. And that causes something called lift. Well, eventually the roof failed because of that. The purlin clips that were holding these panels together would fail. They couldn't take the pressure anymore and pop. And these roof panels would not disappear below, but would be pulled up on top. And that's how the roof started to fail. And then the city came in because one of these panels wound up on the Grand Central Parkway, hit a car, caused a lot of damage. People were upset, made headlines in the paper. Within a day or two, Parks Department came out and said, okay, we're closing things up. And that's what exactly happened.
Yeah, I want to just ask or mention real quick. I had seen pictures of the roof with the panels askew, and as you mentioned, they were lying up there on the top. So it's pretty interesting to think about. You know, you think something's going to fail, it's going to fall to the ground. In this case, it was failing going up. It's a real unusual situation.
Yeah, the causes of lift were pulling them up out of their basically socket, because that's what they were clamped into. Is like a panel was put in between two cables and locked in place by purlin pins, and the force of that low pressure was pulling up on the sides of the panel, forcing it to go up. And that's exactly how it failed. I remember seeing it personally, some of those panels pulling out, except for the one that I stepped on and went below me. But that caused the demise of the roof. Now, when the Parks Department contracted for that roof to be taken down, the initial contractor came on in and assessed the situation and gave a price, and they just came in with all kinds of jackhammers and drills and chainsaws and just cut everything up. Didn't care how it fell down, and most of it fell down below, causing damage to the floor. A lot of it fell outside of the pavilion, some of it fell on the mezzanine. But here, this picture, by the way, is a kind of a work of art that shows one of the Caldwell panels being used as a storefront, and really nice with LED lighting. I was hoping that, you know, someday that we could have something like that for the pavilion, but unfortunately, nothing like that.
Right. Well, yeah, it's unfortunate. I do have a picture I can pop up of when the rink got closed. But before it got closed, just take us over to U.S. for a
Oh,
moment.
yeah.
You explored inside there, and then you took some souvenirs from there back to New York for a while. Some benches.
Well, what had happened was I had explored all the buildings in the park, including terrace on the park. I had free reign, and I'm thankful for that because no one questioned me. Most of the people knew me from the State Pavilion for walking on that crazy roof and bolting it down. And that goes with the Parks Department as well as the police department. So I'd have free reign of just about any structure there. And one of the buildings was the federal building, or the U.S. Pavilion. And at that time, a fence was installed because a lot of people were gaining access. Mostly the guys that were going to the concerts would bring their girlfriends in and, you know, entertain them and smoke pot and have a drinking party. So when I had an opportunity to go in the pavilion, I found out where all the circuit breakers were, and were able to light up the building on an interior basis. Granted, there was someone living between 67 and 70 that made headlines in the Long Island press. And that was, there was a so-called phantom living in that building for a number of years. And this person actually worked at the fair, from what I understand, and was unemployed, couldn't find work for a number of years, and found that the federal building, the United States Pavilion, was the perfect place to live free of charge. So he actually took care of the building in the sense that he chased a lot of unwanted desirables out. But when I got there, he wasn't around anymore. And there was one room that was an auditorium that had these oak benches that I thought would be a great add-on to the roller rink to have people sit down and make them useful. So Bob, Chris, and I, the operators of the rink, gained access to the building one time, and we got permission to take those out and utilize those over in the State Pavilion. But I can recall seeing for the first time, other than at a local YMCA, a microwave oven. As rare as it sounds, or crazy as it sounds now, back then it was really rare. There was a full-size kitchen in there next to the auditorium that had these benches that had all kinds of pots and pans lined up, and it looked like it was ready to go. And I don't know if they served meals there for executives or not. I had no idea, but most of the building, what was left, was desolate. And later on, vandals got in. Most of those vandals, by the way, were locals. A lot of that stuff that was taken out were not just fair or post-fair people interested in saving something from the World's Fair and having some sort of a souvenir to show off. No, they were caused by people that were just wanting to be destructive, and people that that actually worked in the park. I hate to say that, but that's the truth. So did I gain any souvenirs? Are you asking me that question? I can read your mind.
No, you mentioned last night the giant bronze eagle outside the pavilion, at the entrance of it, that it went home with somebody from the park.
Yeah, in Corona.
Yeah.
I can remember very clearly. And realized some other structures were removed throughout the years. And does it make sense? No. Unfortunately, it's just either people just wanting to do damage and trying to make a few dollars by selling off these goods. And for the most part, I think a lot of the destruction, again, was because of people just wanting to show that they had the upper fist against the federal government and also the city of New York. It's a shame, but it's being repeated right now again, as we see in our society.
Oh yeah. Let me just pop up a picture here on share screen. So now, unfortunately, the roof kept popping off. The state was, or the city was afraid it was going to kill people, and the rink had to close. Correct?
That's correct. And Bob had thought of different ways of finding funding to reestablish the roof, but it was just prohibitively expensive back then to go ahead and install a new roofing system. Granted, even back then, some of the cables were starting to pull away from the compression ring. You're a doggy. Not
Yeah.
mine.
Let me close mine.
So most of you, if you look up and you can see the cabling system that's up there, the upper and lower, that all has to be eventually replaced. There's lots of signs, and even within the Parks Department's surveys and reports showing it. By the way, you're glowing lime green, Bill.
I don't know. I look fine to me. I can't look at the other laptop. I have no idea why some people see me going lime green. Let me stop the video and start it again. See if that brings me back.
Okay. No, there you go, back to normal.
Okay.
But a lot of the work that has to be done on the building has to do with that cabling system and also the pile system underneath the building. All those cables will have to be replaced if they're going to put a new roof in.
Oh,
Even
sure.
back in '74, they would have had to been replaced if a new roof was put in. It wasn't just a matter of replacing the panels with something new.
Right. Did Bob ever think just about taking the roof down and keeping the roller rink going without the roof, or were there other factors that led to the end of the rink?
He did. He certainly stayed around for over a year. I think it was a year and a half trying to work things out with the city. But because the city at that time was going bankrupt and not willing to negotiate with Bob, evidently there was no hope for the pavilion. Until 3 years later, I talked to a bunch of investors in taking over the post office building, which we made into a roller rink back in '77 and '78.
Yeah, you were mentioning yesterday that the giant pile of roller skates, which we see some sitting behind Jim Brown, were actually dumped in the New York State Pavilion after the post office roller rink finished, correct?
That's correct. Those skates that were found in the State Pavilion, along with records and a phonograph. I see that iconic picture showing a shopping cart filled up with skates and a phonograph laying on its side. That was not from the time of the rink. Those skates came from the post office pavilion. And how do I know? I can tell by the boots and by the plates. Of course, being in the industry, you would know this. But the records and the phonograph did not come from the era of roll around. We didn't use record players back then. We used a reel-to-reel system of tapes and played music that way.
Right. So now the rink closed, life moves on. You got a career in aerospace and that. But then a few years later, you came up with an idea, which again, some people may not be familiar with, but to turn the wreck of a pavilion into something modern. So let's see if I can zoom in on this a little bit for folks. So would you like to chat a little about your museum dreams?
Yes. So after attending years of different conventions and being in the industry and being involved with the commercial aviation and aerospace defense, I got to know a lot of the CEOs and presidents of various companies in the industry. And I ran by the idea of, would you guys be interested maybe in participating as a sponsor of a building that's been left over from the fair that has no adoptive reuse purpose currently? Would you be interested in sponsoring something like that? And that's how things started. A meeting between Bill Young, myself, and Craig Bavaro at Frankie Campione's Create building in the Chrysler building in New York City came up with the idea of having an aerospace museum. And I ran this, of course, to the sponsors, and everyone was tickled. Everyone thought it was a great idea. Unfortunately, Frankie had spent lots and lots of money of his own. I've spent quite a few dollars myself going back and forth and taking off time and taking the time to travel from Phoenix, Arizona to New York to convince the city leaders that this is the way to go and to save the building. Some resistance, yeah, from Estelle Cooper, who knew of me from her daughter. My daughter and I went to school together. She used to call me the boy from Queens whenever I saw her. Oh, here's the boy from Queens. That was my nickname to Estelle Cooper. She did not like the idea of having another museum in the park. Although I ran the idea and sat down with Alan, I believe it's Friedman, Dr. Friedman of the Hall of Science, because we didn't want to compete against what they were doing with the Hall of Science back then. And he was absolutely for it. In fact, he was willing to help out in any which way he could. And he thought it would be great to have the rockets restored and put over to the New York State Pavilion, as well as other ideas that he ran by me. And the resistance mainly came from the Parks Department. The borough president, Claire Schulman, was 100% for it. The engineers within the city was all for it. Went to lots of different meetings, did lots of presentations. Estelle kept on saying, but I don't want another building in my park. You know, we've got enough buildings. I'd like to see it torn down. And eventually I was just so aggravated and pissed off, to be honest with you. I made a call to Henry Stern, the commissioner of the Parks Department. And I said, you know, we're spending a lot of time. We have a lot of experts looking at the foundational issues, looking at the structural issues. We're doing this as a love. It's costing us money. We have a proposed idea that's backed up by industry. All we ask, Mr. Stern, as you as the landlord, can you go ahead and shore up the foundation and make it viable that we can put a museum or have another idea that maybe you would think of for use of the building? And he just ranted and raved, and I thought he was going to curse me out on the phone. He said to me, and he hung up, by the way, And I called him back the next day and I said, "Are you calmed down?" He says, "Look," he says, "I want that building torn down." That's what he told me. He says, "I'm going to make sure it gets torn down." And that was the end of the conversation. Granted, he might have had a change of heart as time progressed. He might have had a bad situation at the office when he had these calls with me. I don't know. You know, there's a lot of perception and a lot of finger pointing, but I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm just basing it on the conversations. And I think he was just having a rough time in the city, facing a lot of issues back then. And so was Estelle Cooper. So therefore, the idea was floated. The sponsor said, we cannot spend any money until the foundations are shored up and a structural assessment be done. And therefore, the whole idea went flat.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, it's I think Estelle. I knew Estelle a bit. I didn't know Stern, but I think their thing was just ignore it and hope it goes away, or it doesn't fall down until they are out of office, and it's somebody else's problem. And then you come poking along and said, "Hey, it's in New York Daily News today," and all of a sudden they're little eyesore out in the back, back 40. Now it's become on the front page of the New York, newspapers. I could understand why Stern was not happy with you.
No, and we were just going by the reports that the Parks Department gave us. And granted, there were no blueprints available for the building. We had to eventually find out that Philip Johnson gave them to Columbia University. The Parks Department didn't even have a copy of the pavilion, the blueprints. They could not even find the structural reports. We had to dig deep and eventually come up with them. And there were several reports given. I was told by Estelle back then, of course, this is in 2002, 2003, that the building was inspected twice a year. We do surveys, we have our own engineers. So I asked her, I said, Estelle, will just provide me that information. I'd like to see these reports, share them with me. And she goes, I don't know where they are. So I just don't think that they wanted the building to be saved in any which way. I think they just wanted green space there and just call it end of the day. Granted, these people that work for the Parks Department are really good people. They work hard. They don't just take things and just bury it. I really feel that they had their best interests, because knowing the guys that I worked with when I was younger and getting to speak with these people later on with the museum concept, including Estelle, I think they really wanted something good for the park. And they do still yet, they're human beings, they're entitled to their opinions, but they do work hard and they still want to provide the best for the public. And it sounds like a commercial, but I'm telling you, from working alongside with these people and getting to know them, even though that there was a lot of adversary, I believe that they do want a good park. I think they want to provide a recreation for people that come and visit. They want to provide as best as they can within the budgets given and as best as to their ability. Granted, they don't have the right to do whatever they want. And that comes from the commissioner, who has a budget and has to answer to the public. And it's very, very complex. They do as best as they can. And my conversations with Henry, although were kind of bittersweet, I know he was trying to do his job, and he was pretty upset, like you said, on the front page of the Daily News, here's the building, and that the building was going to collapse. That was just based upon the reports that were available to the Daily News, not something we came up with. It wasn't based upon any sort of nonsense. It was based on fact. And they just didn't like it because they had not been maintaining it as a landlord for years. They didn't have the money.
Yeah.
Well, it boils down to money.
It all comes down to money. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking this through. Why don't we open this up to comments from the audience? So if people would like to use the raise hand button, you'll pop up to the upper left corner of the screen and I'll notice you, or you can wave your hands left and right and we'll try to catch you. So I appreciate you sharing it with us, Charles. And
My pleasure. But I think accolades to a lot of people out there that have shown a great concern and love for the pavilion. Guys like the paint crew, as I mentioned earlier, Johnny Pyro and his crew. And we also look at guys like Matthew Silva, who went out on a limb and put together a documentary on the building. And it took great effort. And of course, a lot of time on his part. And then there was guys like Bill Young, who put together a World's Fair site, took a lot of time investigating the history of the fair. And guys like you, Bill, you know, that have shared all these photos that you've collected and spent zillions of dollars on, and wonderful books.
My wife's on the call. Stop the mic. Stop the mic. Oh,
You know, and also, how about King Woolley? King Woolley has been the guardian of this pavilion for years. He has showed as best as he possibly could concern, and of course he wants to see something go on that's positive. And definitely he deserves great accolades and a great applause for saving the building from its demise at this point. And back when he showed up.
He's a great guy, and I know I've been with him when he's had to shoot some people out and fixing some of the things that have been done. So yeah, he's a great resource.
And then of course, Frankie Campione, as well as Alan Ritchie of Philip Johnson and Associates. They have spent a lot of time showing concern, wanting to do something positive. So all of those people, and forgive me if I didn't come up with someone else's name, but we all are somehow attracted to this pavilion. It's kind of mystical. It could be considered spiritual almost. And we all want to see something done positive to the structure. We don't want to see it torn down.
No. Hey, one quick thing, as if anybody is getting ready for questions, just tell everybody again about parking the elevator.
Oh, and I believe there was a gentleman that commented on one of the sites yesterday that was actually there to see the elevator launch. So back in the early 70s, the building, as I mentioned, was inspected by the chief engineer of the Parks Department on an annual basis. And the elevators by law had to be inspected. And I think it's still a law within New York City that all elevators have to be inspected on an annual basis. So the elevators had not been utilized for years since the fair. So we're looking at maybe 5, 6, 7 years. And I was out there with Nick Fichera, the park engineer, and there were a couple other inspectors there. And they had planned to just run the elevator to see if it would operate. And the way that you would get the power on is going back, as I mentioned, down to the Theater Rama building and hitting on the switches, and that would activate power to the elevator system. And the elevators, both elevators, by the way, were at the ground level. Okay. I'm surprised they didn't get destroyed even back then, but they were pretty much intact. So I told Nick, I said, being that these elevators could be damaged like other things around the park, I said, let's go ahead and park one in the middle, and let's go ahead and park one down below, down in the sub basement. And that's what we did. We let them go up. They went up and down a couple of times, by the way. And then it was the decision that Nick said, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do that to save them. And obviously, because of deterioration, that was the last time they ran.
Yeah, you can see them supposedly moving in the movie The Wiz, but that was done through animation, I believe.
Yeah, that was. And most of the, you mentioned The Wiz, most of the globe replacement, light replacement, electrical replacement was done by the producer of The Wiz at a cost of over $1.5 million. He handed it over to the city and said, we can go ahead and take it down, or you can keep it, but we're giving you $1.5 million gift. The city back then said, nope, take it all down, make it the way exactly it was. So everything just kind of disappeared magically.
The theory of politicians at times. So
well, realize also there was no money to support and maintain what was left behind.
Yeah. Well, appreciate you taking us through it. Folks, questions, comments? There was a question earlier about the map. It's a terrazzo floor map, which was a reproduction of Texaco road map, Texaco being the sponsor of the world's biggest road map, I guess, done at the time. So it's totally in ruins, buried under a bunch of dirt. Hey, Jim, while you're on, well, you guys have been working at Pavilion. Did you ever find any remnants or signs of the covering of the map that Charles put on several times a year?
No, because it would be, as he said, polyurethane, and that would wear off over the years. In fact, the surface of that terrazzo now looks like nothing's ever been on it. But as I said, it just wore off.
Thanks. Your audio is real bad today, by the way, for some reason.
There it is. My mic was under my chin. Sorry about that. Because it was polyurethane, it wore off.
Okay.
There's no sign of anything on it. It wasn't durable enough to last through weather.
Right. Yeah, I just didn't know if any pieces ended up over in the corner. And Jim, you did get better. Just so you know, if you're doing another talk, there's some some other background noise or something besides it having been down below. It's
It might have been my beard rubbing against the mic.
I got
some
a
weird
right now.
sound. You can listen to the playback of it and hear it. Just in case
Okay.
they don't keep
Well, while
bugging.
my mic's open, I just want to show that these are, like you get the background, these are the pieces of that roof structure. But we believe that these are the ones that were on the towers, not on the tent. And on the top here, you can see there's like a black adhesive that the panels were glued to. But these, and they have like this interlocking, trying to get it turned off my background, these interlocking things where they kind of lock into one another.
Great.
But these were on the towers, and we have the pieces of white plexi that we have on display in the museum when we used to be open.
Great. Thanks. Baron, you had your hand up.
I did. Well, Charles, that was very informative. Thank you very much.
Like I said earlier, the story only gets better as time goes on. Flights of fancy, things like that always come on through the.
Yeah, I have a couple things. I guess I'm not quite clear. When it turned into the roller skating rink, did you completely cover up the terrazzo map of the state of New York, or how did that happen, or did everybody just roll across that? I think I'm lost in that context.
That's a great question. So in order to protect the floor, as I mentioned earlier, a polyurethane coat was applied, and it was applied throughout the whole entire mat. And we put in a railing system going down the middle of that mat. So there would actually be 3 different rinks. You'd have the main rink, and you have 2 side rinks that people can utilize.
You don't happen to have a picture of it, or Bill, you haven't gotten a picture of it when it was in the roller skating rink age. What do you, that we could see or show next time?
You had that picture look
Sorry, my
earlier.
dog is objecting. I don't know what she's objecting to, but she's objecting. No, I don't have any good pictures. And when you put the covering down, sorry for her, could you see through the covering onto the map? Or is the map, was it opaque?
Oh, yeah, the coating was kind of like a clear yellowish coating, so it was clear. And you'll see pictures in the past of where the coating actually was being darkened by the UV effect on it. And again, it did protect the floor to a certain extent, and it had to be applied every couple months.
But theoretically, the idea was to protect the floor with some sort of protectant, and so that everybody could, when they're roller skating around, they could still at least see the map.
Oh,
Or was
yeah.
the objective totally covered up and just obliterated from view?
The thing that we found most interesting is when people came to skate, they would get a geography lesson of the state of New York. And a lot of people always would go to different areas, and you kind of were wondering what's going on there. And they would be talking about this town or that town.
Gotcha.
So you couldn't see the coating at all until after a couple months, after wear and tear, it would start to yellow.
Gotcha.
But you could still see the floor.
Great. Thanks. Joey? You still there, Joey? You look frozen. I think we might have lost Joey's connection.
I got some questions.
Go ahead, Irv.
Charles, I was wondering, when you climb up on the roof, isn't that rather a flexible roof and would probably bounce and shake quite a bit? And what did you actually stand on? Were you actually standing on the fiberglass panels? Did it support your weight?
And that's a great, great question, Irv. So when you access the roof through the staircase, as previously discussed, and then there was, of course, this extension ladder put across it, you were actually walking on the panels, and they were pretty sturdy. They did not give. You could feel at times certain panels that were weakened, that actually the adhesives that were used between the aluminum channeling that Jim just showed earlier, it was failing. And the life expectancy of the roof was 3 to 5 years, so it was way, way past its life expectancy. And they just didn't have the technology and the adhesives as we have now, which
Didn't the roof flex as you walked across it?
no, not at all.
Didn't flex at all?
No.
Weren't you
not-
afraid a panel would give way under your feet? It was only glued in place.
Well,
He was 16. He didn't know.
How old were you then?
I was 16 at the time. So what do you know when you're
16,
16? And your boss says, just keep looking straight, don't look down. And of course, there were many times where I would sit on those panels and felt comfortable enough to sit on them because we were putting bolts through them. And the only way that you could do that is to lay down on the panels, but I felt comfortable.
I would be afraid of falling through the darn thing. I
Now,
got a
the
question.
panel, as I mentioned, that did fall underneath me, but the panels were very, very solid. Unfortunately, it was, in my opinion, because of years of decay, years of not having any maintenance, that eventually they failed.
Yeah, but what held the panels in place on the cables? That's what I worry about failing.
Well, purlin clips. These are special clips that were used to attach the actual fiberglass panels onto the cables. And with enough pressure exerted on the underside where these clips were installed, they eventually gave up their strength and popped off, and the panels would just go up.
So that roof was designed to have people walking across it?
Yeah, it had to
Absolutely.
be that way. That's how they built it. They walked across as they built it. I want to just jump over to Richard Herring. He has his hand up patiently. So Richard, there you go.
Thanks. Kind of a design question. Do you know if the roof is really an ellipse or an ellipse-like thing?
And that's a question I hear commonly. Supposedly
Yes.
it's an ellipse.
Okay.
Supposedly. Now, I've never met Philip Johnson. Frankie Campione had talked with Philip many, many times, but I believe from the diagrams, from all the information, it's not round as many people think it is. It's an ellipse.
Oh, no,
And
it's definitely not
on
round.
the ground.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I was going to ask, is there a difference between an ellipse or an oval? Because it's definitely not round.
Correct. A lot of people think it's round, but it's not.
Yeah, I don't know why he went to that particular shape. I think he said it was something to do with structural integrity or something, but it certainly has worked. It's still standing all these years later.
Well, as he said, he builds things to last forever. And this is a true testimony. Now, there was a lot of flack in the past of what he thought about after the fair and the building looking so desolate and corroding. And he retracted that statement, that he said he enjoys seeing the building in its current state, which would been in deterioration. Later on, he did retract that, and he did want to have the building repurposed and reused.
Right. Well,
Can I
then-
ask you a structural question about that building? When you
You
look
must
at
be
the
an
ring
engineer.
girder, you look at the ring girder on top, what is holding it up? It looks like they built it on the ground, they jacked it to the height they wanted, and then they slipped through some I-beams through the slots in the concrete columns. And those I-beams is all that's supporting that ring girder at its present elevation. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. So when they built the roof on the ground, they had already poured the concrete and formed what we know as the 16 columns. In order to jack it up, they had to actually have 16 more columns added, and these were temporary columns to jack up the roof. I think it was 30 inches per day that the roof was actually jacked up, if I'm correct. And what holds it together is compression. There's an outer compression ring, which we see as the crown. And then there's the tension ring in the middle. It's kind of a bicycle hub. And it's the tension between everything that's keeping it in place. Granted, if you look at some of the reports from the Parks Department, a lot of those cables are pulling away from not only the compression areas, which probably have to be replaced or at least repaired, but the tension ring is failing big time. It's corroding, and there are areas you can see right through it. And that's the danger right there. You know, all it's going to take is a few of those cables to snap, and then who knows what's going to happen thereafter. That would be my concern.
But the whole thing that supports the weight of that roof is just those horizontal girders sticking through the slots in the concrete columns. That's all that's holding it up there?
That's all that's holding it. Nothing
And they're
else.
free to slide for expansion and contraction. They slide within the slots.
That's correct. Yeah,
That's pretty amazing. It's just balanced very carefully up there.
that's right.
You know, Charles, when you were mentioning about the cable snapping, it brought me to the thing that happened in Puerto Rico this past year with the radio telescope. That same sort of thing. They had it, the cables were starting to deteriorate. They didn't pay attention to it. And one of the cables snapped. Oh, well, we've got a bunch of other cables. Well, another cable snapped. And all of a sudden, the whole thing came crashing down to the ground and is permanently destroyed. So, you know, hopefully somebody's going up and paying attention to that before we end up with Puerto Rico again.
I hope so, but there's enough cabling there, I think, that can support it, even if a few of those cables did decide to pop.
Jim has his hand up.
I have one concern about a cable that's snapping on one of the orbital rings of the Unisphere. It snapped. It looked like they fixed it about 2 years ago, and it's been re-snapped ever since. And the bottommost portion that's nearest the African pavilion, that cable is snapped. And I reported it, but nothing's been done about it. And I'm wondering when the next one's going to snap.
That's just a shame.
Of course, I knew about it when I reported. It wasn't me the only one. I mean, I spoke to, forget his name, but I mentioned it. He said, yeah, we know about it.
If you have a link to report it, let me know. We can pass it out, and maybe a whole bunch of us can. Or maybe Charles can get it on the Daily News front page.
We need Nick Hirschron.
Right.
Go back and work for the Daily News. Yeah.
Yeah. Joey, you left, you came back. You still there, Joey?
Yeah, our internet went out. Or I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah, I was abducted by the old Flushing Meadow Park gang that Charles was talking about. They're only loyal to Robert Moses, and they hate everything to do with preservation. Anyway, it's important to realize that people that didn't know the park back then or didn't frequent the park, how empty that Charlie was talking about, how empty it really was. And it wasn't a place that you went to just to walk through. And it really was like a very isolated spot as a park. And I remember my dad would take me there, and that wonderful, wonderful day or night, actually, we stayed too long, and we were, my dad said, the fence is open. This must have been about 1970. The fence was open. There was a way to walk into the New York State Pavilion, and it was at night. It was about 10 o'clock at night. We had stayed too long. And he told me, go to the center and look up. And of course, the mosaic was still up there, and things were banging around up there in the night. And I remember being so scared, and I didn't want to look up. And my dad would say, no, look up, it's great, you know. And that's a fond memory. But I also remember us being bothered there on our way out. So the park was a completely different place than you see it today.
And, you know, just reflecting back, I think Robert Moses, although he's received a lot of criticism about a lot of different things, and you know, everyone has an opinion about him either way, but at least he had the foresight many, many years ago, before even having a World's Fair, thinking that this would be a great place for people, especially the blue collar workers who lived in Queens and in Brooklyn. And that's what it mainly consisted of for many, many years. The blue collar workers needed a place of recreation. They needed a place to have family outings and picnics. And thankfully, he kept that promise to making Flushing Meadow Park. And of course, I think he'd be upset to see all those buildings there right now, from especially USTA. But you know, they needed an expansion too, and I don't know how they were able to do that, but I think he would be upset about that, because people need green space. They need an area to run around. Kids need to play. They need to be different recreational vehicles there. You know, people want to play baseball, soccer, whatever. And at least he had the foresight way, way back then as a planner to think about the average Joe. And I'm thankful. And the average Joe, there you go. He thought about you. But it's true. At least he had the foresight again to consider the average man and having relaxation time with his family, which is
Oh yeah, Queens owes him a hell of a thanks. Hey, let me pull up a picture here in 1 second. I see Ken Carpenter on the screen, and Ken's going to talk about Ken's presentation next week. But let me just pull this up real quick, Ken. I'm going to put you on the spot. And let me just get this picture here. We all know that when the Mars rover just landed recently, you clever guys at NASA hit a code in the parachute design that brought the thing down. Does anybody ever know anything about any pattern of why the different color squares were done in the way that they were? Anybody ever talk to you, Charles, or anybody know anything about how we ended up with the blues and the you know, the reds and everything, and the different shapes? I mean, I wanted to know, are we sending a message to Mars with this thing?
Yeah, maybe we are. You know, there was a lot of talk about all the panels being originally designed to be blue, opposed to violet and some of the other colors that you see orange. And I heard that they ran out of material, Caldwell, of the blue material to make enough in time to have this finished for the World's Fair. So they came up, of course, with different colors, and there's only 4 colors there. You know, the picture behind you shows a transparent fiberglass upper panel. Eventually, because of deterioration, that was turned opaque.
Right.
And you could not really see through it too well. But it seems to, you know, work back then for a number of years after the fair just fine.
Again, I think the guys at NASA, you know, I mean, I got a kick out of Men in Black. Why on earth would you have a World's Fair in Queens, right? You know, to be the landing site for the UFO. So maybe Kenneth can't tell us that. But Kenneth, would you like to tell us about your talk next week?
Sure, I will. Before that, just it's kind of funny. Maybe you saw this on my web page, but Chris Kelberg actually had posted a picture of the tent and on my page and said, "Do you notice a pattern, Ken?" And it went right over my head. I was like, "Well, I see plenty of patterns, but you know, what in particular are you talking about?" And he was talking about the pattern on the parachutes. So I don't know if anybody, you know, back in the '60s built in a pattern there, but it does make you wonder. It looks remarkably similar to what was on Perseverance parachute. Take a picture of the sides, the colors are even similar. But anyways, yeah, next week Bill asked if I would dive into my rather extensive photos of modern day Disney, the domestic theme parks. So looking at both Disneyland and California Adventure, and then the parks in Orlando, as well as a few shots that I've acquired over the years of what I call echoes of Walt that are in the Los Angeles area. And I'm sure folks that live out there have seen them probably, but a lot of us you know, probably haven't. So I thought it'd be fun to go through. I've tried to pick shots. Almost all of them are my own shots. There'll be a few other ones inserted where they seem you know, too cool to resist. But I've, trying to pick things that aren't the standard ones that everybody sees all the time. So hopefully it'll be enjoyable and not too much of what I did on my summer vacation thing, but just some cool photos for photo and art's sake, and obviously enjoying Disney.
Yeah, Ken has promised it's not going to be, here's my wife Susan in front of the Living Seas. Here's Susan over at World of Motion.
No, it's going to be more like, here's Bill and Carol in front of.
We
So
can
you
take
say,
her
Ken?
out to what you call it, Vasquez Rocks with us, right?
Yes, I didn't put any of those in. Maybe I should.
So you say, Ken?
Yeah,
That Mars rover parachute, those are not random patterns. A couple sharp-eyed people studied it, and it's actually a binary code, and they were able to crack it and translate it.
Yep, dare great things.
Yes, that's right. And there's a date on it too. So it didn't take long for some eagle-eyed people to see there was more to it than just a random blotch pattern.
JPL always, manages to do some cool things that I'm not sure the rest of us even allowed to do, getting their name in there and everything. I don't know if we could actually do that. It's clever. And a lot of us didn't know about it in advance. They kind of announced it later, I'm sure, and it was an internal thing for a long time. People that worked in the program probably knew.
Like
but
an inside Easter egg joke.
you look at it and by gosh, it's really there.
My next door neighbor works at JPL and he worked on the program and he didn't know it. So, because he worked on one piece of it and, everything's in a silo. So you're working on your piece of it and the guys over there, hey, let's have some fun. So yeah, it was a surprise to a lot of people. The people
might
that
be one of
don't
those.
know it's the
Might
core.
be one of those things that you don't announce until you make sure you're down safely and in one piece.
Yeah, because otherwise they'll give you hell. Oh, you had so much fun doing your silly thing, you didn't get it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but the parachute, if you decode it, it tells you the coordinates for JPL and the latitude and longitude and how to find it. So, well, Charles, I really appreciate your doing this, taking the time out. Charles has a very busy schedule because he's still a skater and you're still teaching skating on Saturdays, and he had to go and cancel some classes and carve some time out for us today. So I appreciate it. I mean, the pavilion, as you said, it's a real lure to a lot of people. Everybody drives by, sees it on the side of the road. But short of the paint crew, there's probably nobody on the planet Earth that knows it as intimately as you do. And I appreciate your sharing some of your anecdotes with us.
Hey, Charles, how come your hair's not gray like the rest of us?
I don't know. And I'm 64 now. Gonna be 65.
Yeah. Well, we're the same age, so I figured your hair coloring is working very well. So
no, but the hair's coming out.
Is
That's
it
the
okay?
only problem.
Say,
It's all
Charles,
natural, believe it or not.
I remember a couple of years ago, you were a regular contributor to the World's Fair forums, and then you stopped writing. I always wondered what happened to you.
Well, that's true, Irv. That's mainly because in the aerospace business, holding different types of clearances, we were asked not to participate in any sort of social media.
Really?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I remember I always enjoyed reading your comments. You posted almost every day.
I did. I really enjoyed the interfacing, but here I am now. I'm no longer having to worry about those issues. And I hope to be a contributor in any which way. I hope to meet some of you people, including you, Irv. Wonderful group. I mean, just a really, really great group. And I know
you're still out in Arizona, aren't you?
I still am, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Wayne's out in Arizona. Maybe you guys are nearby. Which cities are each of you in?
I'm in Phoenix.
And Wayne, where are you?
I'm in Sarita, which is south of Tucson.
Oh, that's south of Tucson. Well, I'm getting back up into the city sometime this summer, by the way. I was contacted by a filmmaker and a vlogger that has a couple channels on YouTube, and he's going to do a walkthrough of the New York State Pavilion. So I'll be back in New York sometime, hopefully in the summer, and maybe some of you can join us. I think it'd be great that you can be a participant in the show.
We had a hand up from Roy.
Hi guys, I'm relatively new. I've joined you guys a couple of times the weeks prior, but I've been I've been a fan of the pavilion. I live here in Queens, probably like 15 minutes away from the park, and I've been I've admired the park since I was a kid. Not until I was a little older, I obviously learned about the history of the fairs and such. But it's very eye-opening. I appreciate all of you that have history of being in the fair, being in the park a little after the fair. But I wanted to ask Charles if if I know he's a little busy, but if he has any plans of writing a book, or if he has a book about his history and about the park.
Roy, I enjoy your input, and it's nice to see someone young and youthful opposed to us older guys out there and kind of reminiscing. And I try not to live too much in the past. That's just my motto. I try not to hold on. I'm a minimalist. Anything I had from the pavilion way back when has been given away. And the only thing I kept is one blue globe and maybe a piece of the floor that was given to me by someone. But to that effect, I don't know if I'm ever going to write a book. I don't think anyone would buy it. You know, there has to be an audience. There has to be a purpose. I would love to write a book. Certainly, being there as a teenager was very rewarding. But at the same time, the park was really not a place for most people to be at. And there was a lot of bad things going on in the city. Just a bad time to grow up in New York in the 70s. It was rough, tons of graffiti, tons of negativity, a lot of distress, a lot of prejudice, just pure hatred was being initiated by the masses. And for me, that's no way to live. But unfortunately, I spun out of that. And, you know, why do we all have to have something negative affecting us all the time? Why don't we do something positive? And this particular opportunity where I get to speak to people like you and everyone else is something positive for everyone. Let's be the example. Let's show we could make the difference. And yeah, maybe someday I will write a book, Roy, but you know, I say someone like yourself, you love the park, you're visiting the park, you know, take advantage of any possibility that you can help the paint crew or anyone that's doing anything positive for the park, because you're just giving back. And that's
Definitely. I've actually wanted to get in contact with a bunch of the guys on here, and I do my part. I definitely tell the rest of the youth and you know my friends and family about the history of the park and what it means to actually, you know, share the area and what it once was and hopefully what it will be in the future. And I definitely you know, admire the history and everything, and I'll definitely do my part, you know, to keep that alive for sure.
That's wonderful. We appreciate that, Roy. Sounds like you're definitely focused and you're enlightening to everyone that comes to the park. And
definitely
just shine as best as you can. And if you see something wrong, you know, I would make a recommendation to talking with someone at the parks level. Maybe they can correct it. But realize they're good people, like I said, but they're very limited in what they can do.
Definitely. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Roy.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining again. Hope everybody has a great weekend coming up ahead of them. And again, for next week, Ken Carpenter, I've seen a number of Ken's pictures, excuse me, over the years, and he's got a great flair for capturing some of the Disney magic. So I'm glad you're doing that, Ken, and hope folks will be able to join us and take a tour. I mean, they get the Disney parks. Florida's open. California is getting ready to open. I personally am not going anywhere near a theme park for the foreseeable future. So I'm intending to get my dose of my pixie dust next week. So thanks all, and look forward to seeing you next week then.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Good job, Charles.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Mission.
Thank you, Bill.